Christine, there are estimates that the worldwide market for batteries can reach $76 billion by 2020. That would be a 23% annual growth rate. Where's that going to come from?
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? 23%. Three sources, really. The first one is the smart grid, the second one is electric cars, and the third one is renewables.
And the cars, I mean, we did have some pretty disappointing numbers out of electric cars. Why do we now think that that's going to be a major source of growth?
Well, I think there's been technical changes in that the range of the cars has increased, or the range of the batteries that drive the cars has increased. So the demand is beginning now to pick up much more strongly.
That's really a very, very important development.
It is, yes,
it? Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And in fact, actually, you know, coming from London and indeed also thinking about Paris, I think that you know, the tightening of the regulatory controls on emissions.
Well, that's very important. I mean, you think of public transport, you know, more and more of the public transport is being powered by electric vehicles, which has got to be reducing pollution, and that's one of the main concerns that drives that sort of regulation.
I think it's really, really important.
And it's across the world, it's not just in Europe.
Yes.
It's also in China and in the States as well.
Yes, well, I mean, China obviously has some of the worst pollution around.
Indeed, it certainly has.
So let's come on to a couple of the other things. You mentioned the grid. Just tell us more about that.
Well, the grid, I think, is something we're going to deal with in more depth on another occasion. But clearly, it's important that you get your batteries attached to the grid so that the grid can actually spread the power that you've stored in the batteries. But that brings me on to the renewables, because that's the area I see as being the most exciting. You know, there's a big push for renewable energy, but of course renewable energy only works when the wind blows and the sun shines. So it's actually quite nice to be able to store the energy you've generated when the wind is blowing for the days when it's not blowing and you need to use it when the demand is higher.
That makes enormous sense.
And there's a lot of potential, particularly in countries like Japan and Germany, where there's of course a big political decision to move away from nuclear generated power.
And that just really adds yet more kind of leverage.
So. Yes, exactly.
And what about domestic demand is for battery storage? Is that there as well?
Well, I think that's there, but I mean, again, the technologies change, because I mean, you think of the number of houses that have solar panels and so on. So again, it would be much more helpful to be able to store that energy instead of selling it back to the grid, as is now the case.
Let's come on to how you actually invest in this. The companies that might form the Wertstein portfolio, where in the world are these going to be located?
Well, the batteries are made across the world. There's a big industry in Germany and in the States, and also Japan. Japan is aiming to have half the world's battery production by 2020. And there's also some in China and Korea as well, so it's quite a extensive geographic spread.
Let's turn now to actually look at how the prices of the Wertstein portfolio of companies have been performing. And they did go up very sharply about 2.5, 3 years ago. And then we had, I think you could call it pretty well, a crash. And then they were really down pretty low for the last 18 months or so. But recently they've started to rise again. Just, Christine, tell us a bit, why did we get that run up and the crash? And why is it now beginning to go back up again?
Well, I think that's probably a normal market behaviour to a new innovation, that you have the initial sort of excitement and almost a bubble created, and then people perhaps realise that they've been a little bit premature in their expectations of growth for the sector, so the price comes right off. Then, you know, new developments are made, and over time then people begin to realise that, for example, the range of the electric cars has got further. So then that's when the market really does begin to take off in a much more sustainable way.
I think that really does fit the facts of what's going on very, very closely. And I think the other interesting thing, I mean, if we look at the valuations, I mean, you have to be a little bit careful, because you can't really use a conventional price earnings valuation, because many of these companies are still at that early stage where they're making losses in some cases. But if you look at other measures, like, for example, price to cash flow, the Wertstein portfolio of battery companies is somewhere around 9 times, which is actually quite low compared to either the Nasdaq or the S&P 500, the broad US equity index. I'm looking here at medians, by the way.
Right, so I guess that's an attractive prospect then.
I think very, very, very much so.
Hence the zeitgeist.
Hence the zeitgeist.